Welcome, dear listeners, to a journey through time and the frozen mountains of Colorado. Today I invite you to immerse yourselves in a story that happened more than 140 years ago, but echoes in our hearts as if it were yesterday. It's a narrative about mercy, about how kindness can flourish even in the most rigorous winters of the soul. You will meet Josiah, a man marked by loss, and Clara, a woman who carries the weight of the world on her shoulders. Together, they will discover that sometimes God uses storms to take us exactly where we need to be. But before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? Comment below with your city or country. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that like. It helps me so much to continue bringing these special narratives to you. Year, 1881. Place, Bear Creek, Rocky Mountains of Colorado. The mercy in the mountain. The wind howled through the pine trees like lost souls seeking shelter. Josiah Wheeler adjusted the blanket over his shoulders and continued sharpening his axe by the crackling fire, each movement of stone against metal creating sparks that danced in the cabin's twilight. For 3 days, the snowstorm had been punishing the Rocky Mountains of Colorado with a fury he hadn't seen since the terrible winter of 1878. The lantern flame flickered, casting long shadows on the dark wooden walls. The aroma of pine wood mingled with the smell of bitter coffee he was heating on the stove. Josiah paused for a moment, looking at the dusty portrait above the fireplace. Elizabeth, his wife, smiled eternally from that oak frame, her clear eyes seeming to follow his every movement through the small room. 8 years since fever had taken first Mary, his little 12-year-old, and then Elizabeth, who never recovered from the pain of losing her daughter. The cabin, which once echoed with children's laughter and lullabies, now knew only the heavy silence of a man who had learned to live with ghosts. Josiah returned to work, the stone sliding rhythmically against the blade. This was how he filled the long nights, keeping tools sharp, repairing fences damaged by time, preparing wood for the fire. Honest work that kept his hands busy and his mind away from dangerous paths. That's when he heard it. Weak knocks at the front door, almost muffled by the wind's roar. Josiah raised his head, frowning. No one would climb the steep trail to his cabin on a night like this, much less someone who knocked at the door with such delicacy. The knocks repeated, more urgent now. Josiah set the axe aside and walked to the window, wiping the condensation from the glass with his shirt sleeve. The snow fell so densely he could barely see beyond the porch. But there, hunched against the wind, were 3 dark figures, human shapes supporting one another. Without hesitation, he unbolted the door and opened it. The icy wind invaded the cabin like a hungry creature, bringing with it snowflakes that danced around the 3 figures huddled on his porch. A young woman in front, with a dark shawl covering brown hair damp with snow. Her eyes, large and dark, met his with a mixture of desperation and determination he recognized. He had seen that look on the faces of miners trapped in cave-ins, people fighting against fate. "Sir," she said, her voice tremulous but firm, "my parents can't walk anymore. May we take shelter?" Behind her, an elderly man with a grizzled beard supported a white-haired woman who could barely stand. All 3 were soaked, shivering, clearly at the limit of their strength. Josiah said not a word. He simply stepped away from the door and made a broad gesture with his arm. "Come in," he murmured, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Come close to the fire." The young woman gave him a look of gratitude so intense that something moved in Josiah's chest, something he thought had died forever. And as the 3 strangers crossed the threshold of his cabin, he couldn't imagine that this storm had brought not just refugees, but the possibility of redemption for a soul that had long considered itself lost in the mountains of its own solitude. But who were these people, and what secrets did they carry in the soaked luggage they left in the snow? The transformation of the cabin was instantaneous. What moments before had been a silent sanctuary now bustled with the fragile energy of lives seeking salvation. Josiah watched as the 3 strangers moved slowly toward the fire, their steps leaving small puddles on the wooden floor. The young woman was the first to speak, removing her wet shawl and revealing a pale face with delicate features. Her hands trembled, not just from cold, Josiah realized, but from something deeper, hunger. He recognized the signs: skin stretched over cheekbones, the way she hesitated before each movement, as if conserving energy. "I'm Clara Ruth Thornton," she said, helping the older woman sit in the chair closest to the fire. "These are my parents, Samuel and Martha." Samuel Thornton was a tall man, even bent by age and exhaustion. His hands, Josiah noticed, bore the characteristic marks of a blacksmith, small scars from ancient sparks, specific calluses from the hammer. Martha, in turn, had fingers that moved with the precision of someone who had spent her life sewing, even now as they trembled from cold. Josiah Wheeler, he introduced himself, moving through the cabin with the efficiency of someone who had learned to care for the injured in mines. He brought clean blankets, put more wood on the fire, set water to boil. Coming from town. Central City, Clara replied, accepting the blanket he offered. Or rather, we were coming from there. Our wagon broke an axle 5 miles down the trail. The mule, she swallowed hard. The mule didn't survive the cold. Josiah nodded gravely. He knew that trail well. Steep, dangerous even in good weather. With the storm, it was almost suicide to try climbing on foot. Do you have food? He asked directly, without beating around the bush. Samuel raised his eyes to him, and Josiah saw their wounded pride, but also the relief of someone who could finally stop pretending strength. Not for 3 days, the older man admitted, his voice hoarse. We spent the last money on medicine for Martha. She had pneumonia last month. Clara placed her hand on her father's arm. Papa, we don't need— Yes, you do, Josiah interrupted, already moving toward the small cupboard where he kept his provisions. And I need the company. It's been a long time since I cooked for more than one person. It was a lie, of course. Josiah had been cooking only for himself for years, preparing simple meals that were more fuel than pleasure. But there was something in the silent dignity of this family, in the way Clara kept her shoulders straight despite exhaustion, that made him want to lie if it preserved their honor. While preparing a substantial soup with dried meat, potatoes, and onions, Josiah observed his guests from the corner of his eye. Clara helped her mother remove wet clothes, replacing them with a dry shirt he offered. Her movements were economical, efficient, those of someone accustomed to caring for others. Samuel, meanwhile, examined the cabin with an artisan's eyes. He noticed the well-made joints of the table, how the floorboards fit together perfectly, the shelves aligned with millimeter precision. Fine work, the older man commented, running his hand over the smooth surface of the table. Did you make this? My partner and I, Josiah replied, stirring the soup. Jake Morrison died last winter, heart. A respectful pause filled the cabin. Martha was the first to break it. We lost our home, she said, her voice weak but clear. Samuel lost his smithy when the Denver bank failed. I sewed for some families, but with the crisis— She left the sentence unfinished. Clara looked at her own hands. My husband died 2 years ago. Accident at the Consolidated Mine. The debts were more than I imagined. Josiah served the soup in wooden bowls, noticing how all three ate with the controlled urgency of people who hadn't had a proper meal in a long time. They didn't ask questions about why he was alone, showed no curiosity about the absence of a wife or children in a middle-aged man's cabin. They respected others' pain. That said a lot about them. When Martha fell asleep in the chair by the fire and Samuel began to nod off, Clara offered to help with the dishes. They worked in silence, and Josiah realized she knew the rhythm of a kitchen, that her movements had the efficiency of someone who had spent years caring for a home. Thank you, she said when they finished, her voice low so as not to wake her parents. Not just for the food, for the way you received us. Without questions, without judgments. Josiah looked out the window where snow continued falling relentless. I was a miner for 20 years, he said finally. I learned that the mountain doesn't ask if you deserve to be rescued when there's a cave-in. It only knows you need air. Clara followed his gaze to the storm outside. And we, she whispered, desperately needed air. But while the Thornton family slept by the fire's warmth, none of them suspected that the storm would bring much more than snow, and that some debts from the past had legs long enough to climb even the most remote mountains of Colorado. Dawn brought a different silence, not the heavy quiet of solitude that Josiah knew so well, but the soft silence of people sleeping safely. The snow had stopped during the early morning, leaving the world outside covered by a white blanket that transformed the harsh mountain landscape into something almost ethereal. Josiah woke before sunrise, as he always did, but this time he didn't get up immediately. He lay in his cot in the corner of the cabin, listening to sounds he hadn't heard in years. Martha's gentle breathing in the chair where she had spent the night, Samuel's low snoring on the rug by the fireplace, and something more delicate, Clara, who slept wrapped in a blanket on the small sofa, occasionally murmuring in dreams. When he finally got up, he found Clara already awake, sitting by the window, watching the sunrise through the snow-covered pines. She had carefully folded the blankets and was sewing something. A tear in her father's shirt, he realized. "Good morning," she whispered, without taking her eyes from her work. Her hands moved with a precision that spoke of years of practice, each stitch small and uniform. "Good morning," Josiah replied, also quietly. He began preparing coffee, the familiar aroma filling the cabin. They worked in companionable silence, he preparing breakfast, she sewing, until Clara began humming softly. It was a melody he didn't know, something with an Irish sound, melancholic but comforting. "My mother used to sing this," Clara explained, when she noticed he was listening. "She came from Ireland during the Great Famine, still a child. She said songs were all she managed to bring from the homeland." Josiah nodded, stirring oatmeal on the stove. "My wife sang too," he said, surprising himself with his openness. "Lullabies for our daughter. The house was always full of music in those days." "Your wife?" "She died 8 years ago. Our daughter, Mary, first. Fever. Elizabeth never recovered from the loss. It was as if part of her died with the child." Josiah poured coffee into 2 metal cups. "This cabin gets very quiet when you're used to voices." Clara stopped sewing and looked at him. I'm sorry about your husband too. Thomas," she said, pronouncing the name carefully, like someone still not accustomed to the absence. "He was too optimistic, perhaps. Always thought the next excavation would be the big discovery. When he died, I discovered he had borrowed money, a lot of money, betting on claims that never yielded anything." Samuel began stirring, waking slowly. Clara quickly put away the needle and went to help him sit up. The older man looked around, disoriented for a moment, before remembering where he was. "The storm has passed," Josiah observed, offering coffee to the man. "But the trail will be impassable for a few days. The snow is too deep." "We don't want to impose," Samuel said, but his voice carried relief. Martha, now also awake, coughed lightly, a sound that made Josiah frown. "It's no imposition," he replied, watching the older woman carefully. "Aunt Martha shouldn't expose herself to the cold again so soon. That cough," Clara bit her lip. "She's better. The pneumonia. I've cared for many cases in the mines. I know how these things can return." Josiah knelt beside Martha's chair, gently placing his hand on her forehead. There was no fever, but her breathing was a bit rough. "A few more days of rest and warm food will do good." During breakfast, conversation flowed more naturally. Samuel spoke about his years as a blacksmith, about how he had built his first forge with his own hands when he came to Colorado seeking opportunities. Martha showed some embroidery she had saved, delicate work that demonstrated exceptional skill with needle and thread. "They're beautiful," Josiah said, examining a handkerchief embroidered with tiny flowers. Elizabeth would have loved these designs. She tried to embroider but said her hands were made for other things. "What did she do?" Clara asked. "Cared for the wounded. When there were accidents in the mine, she was the one who stitched cuts, immobilized broken bones, watched over those with high fevers." Josiah smiled, a rare and precious expression. "She said God had given her hands for healing, not decorating." Clara looked at her own hands, calloused, with small needle cuts, worn nails. "Mine are working hands, not for healing or decorating." "They're honest hands," Josiah said simply. "That's worth more than decoration." In the afternoon, while Samuel rested and Martha dozed by the fire, Clara insisted on helping Josiah with chores. She washed clothes, including the pieces the family had brought in their soaked luggage, and hung them near the fireplace to dry. She reorganized the pantry with an efficiency that spoke of experience managing a house with few resources. Josiah watched her work, noticing how she found pleasure in small tasks, in the way she folded a blanket precisely, how she arranged dishes in the cupboard, leaving everything perfectly aligned. There was grace in her movements that contrasted with the roughness of her hands. When the sun began to set, Clara returned to sit by the window with her sewing. This time it was one of her own clothes, a simple dress, but one she was mending with special care. "Where were you going?" Josiah asked, sitting on the other side of the table with a piece of wood and a small knife. He had begun carving something, a habit he'd developed in recent years to keep his hands busy. "We didn't know very well," Clara admitted. "Maybe Boulder or further west. Anywhere we could start over without the weight of debts following us." "What kind of debts?" Clara hesitated, then sighed. $200. To loan sharks from Denver. Thomas borrowed to invest in a mining concession that turned out to be a fraud. When he died, I discovered the money was from dangerous people." Josiah stopped carving. $200 was a fortune, more than a miner earned in 2 years of hard work. "And you thought you could run forever?" "Not forever," Clara said, her voice growing weaker. just until we could gather enough money to pay at least part of the debt. Show good faith. Josiah looked out the window, where the mountains rose like sleeping giants against the darkening sky. Men like that, he said finally, don't settle for good faith. I know, Clara whispered, and for the first time since arriving, her composure seemed about to break. I know. But as night fell over the cabin and secrets of the past came to light, none of them could imagine that at that exact moment, 3 men on horseback were following the last tracks of the Thornton wagon in the snow, tracks that would lead directly to Josiah Wheeler's door. The third day in the cabin brought subtle but significant changes. The snow began melting under the strong morning sun, creating a constant sound of dripping from the roof and small streams running down the mountain. Samuel, who had seemed revitalized by rest and food, began coughing during the early morning. A deep, wet cough that made Josiah sit up immediately in his cot. He knew that sound, pneumonia. Clara heard it too. Josiah saw her rise silently from the sofa and kneel beside her father, placing her hand on his forehead. Even in the dim light, he could see the worry in her tense shoulders. He's warm, she whispered when Josiah approached. Very warm, he confirmed, feeling the fever radiating from the older man. I need to check his lungs. In the mines, Josiah had learned rudiments of medicine by necessity. When someone got hurt miles underground, there was no time to call a doctor. He listened to Samuel's breathing, noting the characteristic rattles that indicated fluid in the lungs. It's what I thought, he murmured to Clara. The exposure to cold, the humidity. Sometimes this happens even when the person seems to be recovering. Martha was now also awake, watching her husband with an expression of terrible knowledge. She had seen this disease before, knew what it could do to men Samuel's age. What can we do? Clara asked, her voice controlled but with a note of desperation. Josiah went to a wooden box in the corner of the cabin, and from it took some small bottles and a bag of dried herbs. I learned some things caring for sick miners. I'm not a doctor, but it's more than we've had, Clara said firmly. During the following hours, Josiah worked with the concentration of someone fighting against time. He prepared infusions of licorice root and eucalyptus leaves to help Samuel breathe. He made hot poultices for the man's chest, alternating them every 2 hours. He kept the fire constantly burning so the cabin stayed warm and dry. Clara worked beside him like an experienced nurse, anticipating his needs, keeping Samuel hydrated, helping him sit to cough when fluid threatened to accumulate too much in his lungs. It was during one of these care sessions, when she held a bowl while Samuel slowly drank the hot infusion, that she began talking about her family. We came from Ireland during the Great Famine, she said, repeating what she had already mentioned about her mother. My grandmother used to say that misery either teaches us to be cruel or teaches us to be kind, that there's no middle ground. Josiah, who was renewing the poultice on Samuel's chest, looked at her. And what did she choose? Kindness, Clara replied without hesitation. Always kindness, even when it cost more than she could afford. And you? What did you choose? Clara considered the question while helping her father lean back against the pillows. I think I'm still choosing, every day. Later, when Samuel finally fell asleep breathing a little better, Clara insisted on preparing dinner. Josiah watched her work in the kitchen, noticing how she intuitively knew the right proportions of seasonings, how she checked the food with the same attention a mother gives to a sick child. Did you learn to cook from your mother? He asked. My mother died when I was 14, tuberculosis. Clara stirred the soup slowly, without looking at him. I had to learn alone. Thomas wasn't very practical with these things. It must have been difficult, marrying so young and having to care for a man. Thomas was a good man, Clara said defensively, then sighed. But yes, it was like caring for a big child sometimes. He dreamed a lot, planned little. Josiah nodded, understanding. Dreamers can be the best people in the world, but not necessarily the best for building a life with. And you, was Elizabeth a dreamer or practical? Practical, Josiah said immediately, smiling at the memory. Terribly practical. When I started talking about opening a bigger mine, about getting rich, she'd remind me we first needed to fix the cabin's roof. She was right. She was always right. Josiah looked at the portrait above the fireplace. But sometimes I wonder if I wasn't too practical, if I shouldn't have dreamed a little more. Clara served the soup in bowls, steam rising in the cabin's cold air. Maybe, she said carefully, we need both, dreamers and practical people. One to imagine what could be, another to build what's possible. They ate in companionable silence, the only sound being Samuel's improved breathing and the fire crackling in the fireplace. Outside, the thaw continued, creating a soft music of running water and constant dripping. When Martha woke to eat, she looked around the cabin with eyes that seemed to be seeing everything for the first time. "This house," she said, her voice still weak but clear, "has a good feeling. The feeling that it was built with love." "It was," Josiah said simply. "Elizabeth chose every board, every shelf. She said a house built with love protects better than any fortress." Martha smiled, a fragile but genuine smile. She was right. "I can feel it." Clara looked around too, noticing details she had missed in the first days. How the windows were positioned to capture morning light, how the shelves were exactly the right height for a woman to use comfortably, how everything in the cabin had been designed to create not just shelter, but home. "No one is obligated to help," she said suddenly, looking directly at Josiah. "That's why it's worth so much when someone chooses to help." Josiah met her eyes, and for a moment, something passed between them, a recognition, an understanding that went beyond words. "Sometimes," he said finally, "helping others is the only way to help ourselves." But while this new understanding blossomed between them like the first flowers after the thaw, 3 men on tired horses had finally found the wreckage of the Thornton wagon on the trail and the footprints in the snow that led directly to the cabin high on the mountain. The 4th day brought clear skies and cutting air that made lungs burn with each breath. Samuel had passed a better night, the fever gradually subsiding under the constant care of Josiah and Clara. Martha, strengthened by rest and regular food, insisted on helping with small tasks, folding clothes, organizing the pantry, things that made her feel useful again. Josiah took advantage of the clear morning to check the cabin's surroundings, checking if the melted snow hadn't caused damage to the structure. Clara accompanied him, wrapped in the thick coat he had lent her, a piece that had belonged to Elizabeth but which she wore without embarrassment, as if understanding that some kindnesses were greater than social conventions. They walked in silence to a small shed, where Josiah kept tools and wood. It was there that Clara saw for the first time evidence of the life he had built alone in recent years. Small wood carvings scattered on the shelves, delicate figures of mountain animals that demonstrated surprising patience and skill. "Did you make all of this?" she asked, picking up a small wooden fox so detailed it seemed about to run. "It became a habit," Josiah said, almost embarrassed. "In the mines, during breaks, some men played cards. I carved." Clara examined other pieces, a bear, a rabbit, a bird with open wings. Each was unique, full of personality and movement captured in wood. "They're works of art," she said sincerely. "Did Elizabeth see these pieces?" "Some. She said I put life into dead wood." Josiah picked up an unfinished piece, what seemed to be a laughing child. "I was making this for Mary but never finished it." Clara held the small figure, feeling the weight of interrupted history in her hands. "Maybe you should finish it," she said carefully. "Not to change the past, but to honor it." They returned to the cabin where Samuel was sitting by the window, looking at the mountains with the expression of someone who recognizes familiar landscapes. "I served in these mountains during the war," he said when they entered. 1862, chasing Confederates who were trying to intercept Colorado gold. "Never thought I'd return here under circumstances like these." "Civil War?" Josiah asked, interested. "2nd Colorado Cavalry Regiment. Volunteers." Samuel straightened his shoulders, and for a moment it was possible to see the young soldier he had been. "We fought at Glorieta Pass, helped ensure Colorado gold reached the Union." Clara looked at her father with a mixture of pride and surprise. "You never told me about fighting in battles." "They're not stories to tell a young daughter," Samuel said. "But now, maybe it's important that someone knows I tried to do the right thing, even when it was difficult." Martha, who was mending a shirt, raised her eyes from her work. "Your father always did the right thing. Sometimes it cost too much." "What does she mean?" Josiah asked. Samuel coughed lightly. He still wasn't completely recovered. "When I returned from the war, I could have claimed free land as a veteran, good land near Denver, but there was a Mexican family already working the property the government wanted to give me. They had small children, nowhere to go." "And you didn't accept the land," Clara concluded, understanding a story she had never heard complete. "I couldn't take a family's home to give comfort to mine." Samuel looked at his calloused hands. "So I became a blacksmith, built everything from scratch. It was harder, but it was honest." Josiah studied the older man with renewed respect. Not everyone would have made the same choice. Not everyone had a wife like Martha to remind me what was right. Martha smiled without raising her eyes from the sewing. I only reminded you of what you already knew in your heart. In the afternoon, while Samuel rested and Martha worked on her embroidery, Clara helped Josiah prepare wood for the fire. It was work that required coordination. He split the logs, she organized the pieces by size. They worked with the synchronization of people who had learned to trust each other. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said after a while. "Of course. When your wife died, did you think about leaving this place, going somewhere where there weren't so many memories?" Josiah stopped splitting wood and leaned on the axe handle. "Every day, during the first year. But then I realized the memories weren't the problem, the loneliness was." "And did you get used to the loneliness?" "I learned to live with it. It's not the same as getting used to it." Clara carefully stacked more wood. "I never learned to live with it. When Thomas died, the loneliness was suffocating. That's why I agreed to live with my parents again. Not because of money, though that was also true, but because I couldn't bear the silence. And now," Clara looked around the cabin, where she could hear Martha humming softly and Samuel moving restlessly on the cot. "Now I'm learning there's a difference between loneliness and peace." Josiah followed her gaze. "This cabin hasn't had peace for a long time. It has it now." That night, after Samuel and Martha fell asleep, Clara and Josiah remained awake, she sewing by lamplight, he returning to work on the small child figure he had shown that morning. They worked in companionable silence, the only sound being the whisper of thread through fabric and the soft scraping of knife against wood. "Clara," Josiah said finally. "Yes?" "When the trail is passable again, you don't need to leave immediately. Samuel is still recovering, and Martha, are you offering work or charity?" The question was asked without hostility, but with the direct frankness of someone who needed to know where she stood. "Work," Josiah said without hesitation. "This cabin needs a mistress. It needs someone who knows how to transform house into home. And I need to remember what it's like to live instead of just existing." Clara stopped sewing and looked him in the eyes. "And what would people say? A widow living in a widower's house? The nearest people are 15 miles from here. And frankly, Clara, after 8 years alone, I don't much care what people might say." Clara considered his words, then returned to her sewing. "I'll think about it," she said finally. But while she considered this possibility of a new beginning, 3 armed men were camped just 2 miles away, waiting for dawn to make a visit that would change everything. The dawn of the 5th day brought more than light. It brought the sound of horse hooves on the trail, a sound that made Josiah stop suddenly while feeding the chickens in the yard. His blood froze when he recognized what it meant. 3 horses, controlled pace of those who know the terrain, the type of approach armed men make when they want to keep the element of surprise until the last moment. He dropped the corn bucket and ran to the cabin. "Clara," he said as soon as he entered, keeping his voice low but urgent, "wake your parents. Now." Clara raised her eyes from the table where she was preparing breakfast, immediately alert. "What happened? Horses on the trail, 3 men." Clara's face lost all color. She ran to wake Samuel and Martha, quickly explaining the situation while helping them dress. Samuel, still weak but determined, tried to get up too quickly and had to lean against the wall to avoid falling. "Don't let them see me sick," he whispered to Clara. "Men like that smell weakness." The knocks on the door came 5 minutes later. Strong, authoritative, the kind of knocking that accepts no delay or refusal. Josiah checked that his rifle was loaded and kept it within reach, but out of direct sight. Then, breathing deeply, he opened the door. 3 men stood on his porch. The leader was tall and thin, with a deputy sheriff's badge shining on his vest. His eyes were cold and calculating, the type of gaze that assesses threats and opportunities in seconds. The other 2 were clearly thugs, big men, armed, with the posture of those accustomed to solving problems with violence. "Good morning," the deputy said, touching his hat brim in a gesture that seemed polite but carried irony. "Deputy Thomas Kane, from Denver. We're looking for a family, the Thorntons. We have information they may have passed through here." Josiah kept his expression neutral. "And why are you looking for the Thorntons?" "Financial matters," Kane replied vaguely. "Nothing that concerns you, of course. Just a civil matter that needs to be resolved." "Civil matter that needs 3 armed men?" Josiah asked without moving from the door. Kane smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "The mountains are dangerous, Mr. Wheeler. Josiah Wheeler. Mr. Wheeler. As I was saying, the mountains are dangerous. A man never knows what kind of resistance he might encounter when he's just trying to do the law's work." Behind Josiah, Clara appeared in the doorway. Kane saw her immediately, and his smile became genuine, the smile of a predator who had just found his prey. "Mrs. Clara Thornton," he said, touching his hat again. "What a pleasure to find you. We were worried something had happened during the storm." "How did you find us?" Clara asked, staying behind Josiah but facing the deputy's gaze. "It wasn't difficult. Wreckage of a wagon. Tracks in the snow." Kane gestured casually. "Besides, we have our methods. Mr. Marcus Goldstein is very persistent when it comes to protecting his investments." Upon hearing the name, Clara became even paler. Samuel, who had managed to get up and was now leaning against the wall, clenched his fists. "Goldstein," he murmured. "Should have figured." "Know the name, old man?" one of the thugs asked, noticing the reaction. Kane gestured for the man to stay quiet. "Mr. Goldstein is a respected businessman in Denver. When someone disappears owing him money, he naturally gets concerned. Concerned enough to hire armed men," Josiah observed. "Just precautions," Kane said softly. "Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Goldstein is willing to be reasonable. If you come with us now, I'm certain you can reach an agreement." "What kind of agreement?" Clara asked. "That's between you and Mr. Goldstein. My job is just to bring you for a civilized conversation." Josiah stepped forward, slightly increasing his posture. "And if they don't want to go?" Kane studied Josiah carefully, assessing. "Well, Mr. Wheeler, that would be complicated. You see, this is a legal matter. Mrs. Thornton and her family have obligations in Denver. It would be terrible if a respectable citizen like yourself got unnecessarily involved in matters that don't concern you." The threat was clearly implicit, but Josiah didn't back down. "It happens that, at this moment, they are my guests, and I take very seriously the responsibility of protecting people who are under my roof." Kane laughed softly. "Admirable, Mr. Wheeler. Very admirable, but perhaps not very practical." "Practicality," Josiah said slowly, "never was my strong suit." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, measuring one another. Kane clearly hadn't expected resistance and was recalculating his options. The thugs moved their hands closer to their weapons, but Kane stopped them with a look. "Very well," he said finally. "Perhaps we can discuss this as civilized men. May I come in?" Josiah hesitated, then stepped away from the door. "So you can come in, but leave your weapons outside." Kane laughed again. "Mr. Wheeler, we are law officers. We don't leave our weapons anywhere." "Then," Josiah said calmly, "this conversation is going to happen here on the porch." Kane studied Josiah for another moment, then nodded. "As you prefer." Clara joined Josiah on the porch, Samuel and Martha remaining visible but safe inside the cabin. Kane leaned casually against the railing, but his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging every detail, every possible advantage. "Mrs. Thornton," he said finally, "I'll be direct. Your late husband owed $200 to Mr. Goldstein. With interest and fees, that amount now reaches close to $300. Mr. Goldstein is willing to accept $250 if paid in full." "And if we can't pay?" Clara asked. Kane shrugged. "There are other ways to settle debts. Mr. Goldstein is a creative man when it comes to finding solutions." The implication was clear, and Josiah felt anger rise in his chest like a wave of heat. "I think this conversation is over," he said. "Oh, Mr. Wheeler," Kane said, straightening up, "I think it's just beginning." And while the two men stared at each other under the cold mountain sun, Clara realized that the storm that had brought her family to this cabin had passed, but another, much more dangerous one, was just beginning. The confrontation on the porch lasted until Kane finally understood that Josiah Wheeler wasn't the type of man who backed down under pressure. After half an hour of veiled threats and intimidating posturing, the deputy retreated, but not before making it clear he would return. "This mountain isn't as isolated as it seems, Mr. Wheeler," he said while mounting his horse, "and winter doesn't last forever. We'll be around." After the three men disappeared down the trail, Josiah locked the door and closed the window curtains. The cabin, which moments before had been a welcoming home, now seemed like a besieged fort. Samuel collapsed into the chair, the confrontation having drained his already limited strength. Martha sat beside him, taking his trembling hand. Clara remained by the window, watching through a crack in the curtain, as if expecting to see the men returning at any moment. "Marcus Goldstein," Samuel said finally, his voice laden with bitterness. "Thomas never told me he had borrowed money from him." "Who is he?" Josiah asked. "Loan shark. But not just any loan shark. He has connections, protection. They say half the politicians in Denver owe him favors." Samuel coughed, a cough that carried desperation beyond illness. Thomas wasn't bad, but he was naive. He thought he could deal with men like Goldstein. Clara finally moved away from the window. "Kane wasn't a real sheriff, was he?" "Probably not," Josiah agreed. Men like Goldstein buy badges when they need to give their business an appearance of legality. So we're fugitives, Martha said quietly. Our family has become a band of fugitives. No, Josiah said firmly. You are honest people who were deceived by a dishonest man. There's a difference. Clara turned to him. Josiah, you don't understand what you've done. By opposing Cain, by defending us, you've put yourself in their path. I understand perfectly. They're going to come back, and next time they'll bring more men. Josiah walked to the fireplace and picked up Elizabeth's portrait. He studied his wife's face for a long moment, as if consulting a higher authority. Elizabeth always said God doesn't put us in people's paths by accident, he said finally. That sometimes we're called to be the answer to someone's prayer, even when we don't realize we're praying. He put the portrait back in place and turned to the family. You didn't come here by accident, and I didn't help you by accident. Maybe this is exactly where we all need to be. Samuel tried to stand. Josiah, you're a good man, but you can't fight Marcus Goldstein. He has money, influence, and I have something he doesn't have. What? I'm home. Clara looked around the cabin. The solid walls that Josiah and Jake Morrison had built with their own hands, the windows strategically positioned to watch the trail, the defensible location high on the mountain. You're thinking of resisting, she said. Literally, I'm thinking of protecting my family. The words came out naturally, but caused a deep silence in the cabin. Josiah hadn't consciously called the Thorntons my family, but once said the words seemed to echo with truth. Martha was the first to speak. Josiah, we can't ask this of you. You're not asking. I'm offering. Clara walked to him, stopping just inches away. And if we say no, if we decide to leave and face Goldstein alone, then I'll go with you. Why? Josiah hesitated, searching for words to explain something he himself didn't completely understand. Because in the last 5 days, this cabin has become a home again. Because for the first time in 8 years, I wake up in the morning looking forward to the day, instead of just surviving it. He looked directly into Clara's eyes. And because when Cain was on my porch threatening you, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. What? Righteous anger. The kind of anger a man feels when someone threatens his family. Clara studied his face, looking for signs of doubt or hesitation. She found only firm determination. This will change everything between us, she said softly. It already has. Samuel and Martha watched the moment between them, understanding they were witnessing something deeper than an offer of protection. It was a declaration of intentions, a recognition of feelings that had been growing since the first day. If we stay, Clara said finally, it can't be as refugees in your house. I can't live as a permanent guest. What are you suggesting? Clara took a deep breath. I'm suggesting that if we're going to face this together, we should face it as a true family, legally. Josiah immediately understood what she was proposing and felt his heart accelerate. Clara Ruth Thornton, he said, his voice becoming formal. Are you proposing marriage to me? I'm offering a partnership, she corrected, but was blushing. An alliance, mutual protection. And love? He asked directly. Clara hesitated, then nodded slowly. And love, if it comes naturally. Josiah looked at Samuel and Martha, who watched with expressions of cautious hope. And you? How do you feel about having a minor son-in-law who just put himself against one of Denver's most dangerous men? Samuel laughed, the first genuine laugh they'd had since arriving at the cabin. Josiah Wheeler, the older man said, I fought in the Civil War for 3 years. I survived the mining boom, the mining bust, and raised a daughter strong enough to propose marriage when necessary. He extended his hand. It will be an honor to call you son. Josiah shook the offered hand, then turned to Clara. So it's decided? It's decided. That night, after Samuel and Martha fell asleep, Clara and Josiah remained sitting by the fire, planning not just a wedding, but a survival strategy. When? She asked. As soon as possible. A legal marriage will give us rights we don't have now. Legal protection. And if Cain returns before that, then we'll face it as fiancés, Josiah said simply. But one way or another, Clara, you're no longer alone in this world. Clara moved closer to him on the bench by the fireplace. Josiah. Yes? Thank you. For choosing to stay. For choosing to fight. Thank you, he said, for giving me something worth fighting for again. But while they planned their future together, Marcus Goldstein in Denver was receiving news that Clara Thornton had found protection and was beginning to plan a response that would test not only the nascent love between her and Josiah, but their own determination to build something lasting in a world that seemed determined to destroy it. A week passed in tense preparation. Josiah had sent a letter to the pastor of Bear Creek Church, setting the wedding for 15 days hence. Clara worked furiously on a simple but dignified dress, using fabric Martha had saved for years for a special occasion. Samuel, gradually recovering his strength, began helping Josiah fortify the cabin, reinforcing doors and windows, creating strategic observation points. It was as if they were preparing for both a celebration and a war. Marcus Goldstein's response came on a cold March morning when 4 riders climbed the trail, Cain and his 2 original thugs, plus a 4th man Clara recognized immediately. "It's him," she whispered, peering through the curtain. "It's Goldstein." Josiah watched the group approach. Marcus Goldstein was a short, well-dressed man with expensive clothes that contrasted jarringly with the mountain's rustic environment. Even from a distance, he radiated authority and ruthlessness. "Remember what we discussed," Josiah said to the family. "Samuel, you stay with Martha in the back room. Clara, you stay in the kitchen, but where you can hear me." The knocks on the door when they came were different this time, more controlled, almost polite. "Mr. Wheeler," came Cain's voice through the wood, "Mr. Goldstein would like to speak with you." Josiah opened the door with the rifle clearly visible, propped against the wall within arm's reach. Goldstein stepped forward, removing his hat in a gesture of apparent courtesy. "Mr. Wheeler, I presume. I'm Marcus Goldstein." His voice had the cultivated accent of someone who had learned to hide humble origins behind expensive education. "I apologize for this intrusion, but I have important matters to discuss." "You can speak from right there," Josiah replied. Goldstein smiled, a smile that carried no warmth. "Very well, I'll be direct. Mrs. Thornton and her family owe me a substantial amount of money. I'm willing to forget this debt entirely." Josiah waited. Men like Goldstein didn't offer forgiveness without demanding something in return. "In exchange," Goldstein continued, "I'd like to make an offer for your property, a very generous offer, $500. It was an absurd amount, well below the property's real value, but well above what a common miner could reject without consideration. "It's not for sale," Josiah said simply. "Mr. Wheeler, perhaps you're not understanding. This is a unique offer. If you reject it, the Thornton family's debt remains, with growing interest. And if I bought their debt?" Goldstein laughed genuinely this time. "With what money, Mr. Wheeler? You're a miner. Even if you had $300, that wouldn't solve the main problem." "What main problem?" "The problem that Mrs. Thornton chose to flee instead of honoring her obligations. This created inconveniences for my business. Inconveniences that require additional compensation." Clara appeared in the doorway behind Josiah. "What kind of compensation?" Goldstein studied her with cold, calculating eyes. "Mrs. Thornton, how radiant you look. The mountain air suits you well." "Answer the question," Josiah said, his voice carrying a clear threat. "Well, there are various ways someone can settle debts when they have no money," Goldstein said casually. "Work, for example. I have several establishments that always need dedicated employees." The silence that followed was charged with almost electric tension. Josiah stepped forward, his hand moving almost imperceptibly toward the rifle. "I don't think you understand the situation," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Mrs. Thornton is under my protection." "Completely." "Ah," Goldstein said as if he had just understood something. "I see. Romance in the mountains. Very touching." His tone became harder. "But romance doesn't pay debts, Mr. Wheeler." Samuel appeared in the doorway, leaning against the wall, but clearly determined to participate in the conversation. "Goldstein," he said, recognizing the man. "Should have figured you'd make it up here." "Mr. Thornton, I see you've recovered from your indisposition. Excellent. Families should stay together during important discussions." "The discussion is over," Josiah said. "I want you to leave my property." "Your property," Goldstein repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting. Do you have papers that prove this?" It was a seemingly simple question, but loaded with implications. Josiah hesitated for a fraction of a second, enough time for Goldstein to notice. "Documents can be questioned," the loan shark continued, "especially when they involve properties acquired through informal transactions. The state of Colorado is very strict about proper property titles." Cain stepped forward. "It would be terrible if we discovered this property was acquired illegally. Squatting is a crime." But it was then that Samuel straightened, new strength entering his voice. "Interesting that you mentioned documents," he said, "because I have some that might interest you." From an inner pocket he withdrew a yellowed envelope. Registered deed to the property, dated 1873, signed by Jake Morrison himself and properly registered at the Denver courthouse. Josiah looked at Samuel with surprise. How did you... You left the deed on the table last night. I'm a blacksmith, not a lawyer, but I learned to read legal documents during the war. Samuel smiled weakly. This property was legally transferred to you when Jake Morrison died. Goldstein has no jurisdiction here. Goldstein's face hardened. Documents can be forged. They can, Samuel agreed. But this one has the official seal of the Denver courthouse. Easy to verify. Kane whispered something in Goldstein's ear, who nodded slowly. Very well, he said finally. Perhaps I was hasty in my assessments. But the Thornton family's debt remains. Then let's resolve this here and now, Clara said, stepping out from behind Josiah. How much exactly do we owe? $300. Paid in full. Clara took a deep breath. What if I offer work instead of money? What kind of work? Sewing, embroidery. I can make fine clothes, work with expensive fabrics, worth at least $50 a month. Goldstein considered. 6 months of work, but it would have to be in Denver, where I can supervise. No, Josiah said immediately. Then, Clara said carefully, how about this? $100 now, the rest in work I can do here. I can make fine clothes and send them to Denver. With the quality of my work, you can sell them for much more than the remaining $200 are worth. It was an intelligent proposal, offering Goldstein real profit without giving him control over Clara. Goldstein studied each of them, calculating advantages and disadvantages. Finally, he nodded. $100 now, $50 in clothes delivered in the next 2 months, and we'll consider the matter closed. Agreed, Clara said, before Josiah could protest. But Goldstein added, if there's any delay, any problem with quality, the debt returns to the original value, with interest. Understood, Clara said firmly. Josiah went inside the cabin and returned with a small leather pouch. $100, he said, handing it to Goldstein. The loan shark weighed the pouch, nodded, and gestured for his men to mount up. Mrs. Thornton, he said before leaving, I hope your change in circumstances is prosperous and permanent. After the 4 men disappeared down the trail, the family remained on the porch for several minutes, barely believing the confrontation had ended without violence. $100, Martha said finally. Josiah, that was years of your savings. It was, he agreed, and it was the best investment I ever made. Clara turned to him. How are we going to get $50 worth of clothes in 2 months? We'll manage, Samuel said with renewed conviction, and then we'll start our real life. But while they celebrated the temporary victory, none of them realized that Goldstein, riding down the trail, was already planning ways to ensure the $50 worth of clothes would never reach Denver, and that the debt would return to being his tool of control over the family that had dared to defy him. Spring came to the Rocky Mountains like a revelation, melting not only the snow from the high peaks, but also the last barriers of formality between Josiah and Clara. With Goldstein's immediate threat temporarily neutralized, they could dedicate themselves to what really mattered, building a life together. The wedding was set for the 3rd Sunday in May, at the small wooden church in Bear Creek. Clara spent weeks working on her dress, not because she wanted to impress the few neighbors who would come, but because she wanted to feel worthy of the man who had chosen to protect her when the entire world seemed against her family. Samuel recovered more quickly than anyone expected. The pure mountain air, combined with useful work and renewed purpose, brought him strength he hadn't felt in years. He began helping Josiah with small carpentry projects, and soon they were planning improvements to the cabin to accommodate the expanded family. Martha, in turn, transformed a corner of the room into a small sewing workshop. Word had spread through the mountains about the quality of her work, and she began receiving orders from women in neighboring towns. It was honest money, earned with genuine skill, and every cent brought them closer to complete freedom from Goldstein. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, with the type of golden light that exists only in mountain springs. The church was simple but beautiful, decorated with wildflowers Clara had picked the previous morning, blue lupines, red paintbrush, white daisies that grew in the high fields. Josiah waited at the altar wearing his best clothes, a dark suit that had belonged to Jake Morrison, adjusted by Martha to fit perfectly. His hands, always so sure with tools and weapons, trembled slightly as he waited. When Clara entered the church on Samuel's arm, Josiah felt the air leave his lungs. The dress she had made was of simple white linen, but cut with an elegance that enhanced her graceful figure. She had left her hair loose, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, held only by a small crown of wildflowers, but it was the look in her eyes that struck him like lightning, not the cautious expression of someone making a practical arrangement, but the genuine glow of a woman in love. "Dear brothers," Pastor Williams began, a gentleman with grey hair who had served the mountain communities for 20 years, "we gather today not only to witness the union of Josiah and Clara, but to celebrate proof that God can create beauty and love even in the most difficult moments." The vows were simple but profound. Josiah promised to protect Clara not only from the dangers of the world, but to protect her right to be herself, strong, independent, capable. Clara promised Josiah that she would bring back to his life not only companionship, but joy, music, the reminder that a house without laughter is just a structure of wood and stone. When the pastor declared them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was tender but full of promise. The first kiss of a life they would build together, brick by brick, day by day. The reception was small but warm, held in the cabin that was now officially home to all of them. The few neighbors who came brought practical gifts, a handmade quilt, homemade preserves, useful tools. Samuel toasted with strong coffee, wishing the new couple all the years of happiness God may grant, and wisdom to value them. That night, after the last guests departed and Samuel and Martha retired to the room Josiah had built for them on the ground floor, the newlyweds were finally alone. Clara had moved to the main bedroom upstairs, but both were conscious that despite the legal marriage, they were still learning to be husband and wife. There was a delicacy in how they moved around each other, careful consideration that spoke of mutual respect. "Mrs. Wheeler," Josiah said, trying out the name. "Mr. Wheeler," Clara replied, smiling. "It sounds good." They sat on the small back porch of the cabin, watching the stars appear in the dark mountain sky. The air was full of spring aromas, wet earth, blooming flowers, the fresh smell of snow melting on the high peaks. "Do you regret it?" Josiah asked after a while. "Marrying you?" Clara considered the question seriously. "No. Letting circumstances decide for us? Maybe a little. I wish we had had time to get to know each other better before taking this step. We have the rest of our lives to get to know each other better." "That's true." Clara leaned in her chair, closer to him. "Josiah." "Yes." "Thank you for giving me the chance to choose you. Even though the situation didn't allow much time for traditional courtship, I feel I made a good choice." Josiah took her hand, the first time he had touched her intentionally as a husband. "Clara?" "Yes. I also feel I made a good choice." 3 weeks later, Clara made an announcement that changed everything. "Josiah," she said one morning while they prepared breakfast together, "I need to talk to you." To all of you. There was something in her voice that made Samuel and Martha look up from their coffee cups. "I'm expecting a baby," she said simply. The silence that followed was full of surprise, joy, and a sudden understanding that the life they were building together was now even more precious and even more vulnerable. Josiah was the first to recover. He stood, walked to Clara, and wrapped her in his arms. "Her baby," he murmured, as if trying out the words. "Our family is going to grow." Martha began to cry, tears of joy and relief. "A grandchild," she whispered. "I'm going to have a grandchild." Samuel stood and embraced both daughter and son-in-law. "This baby," he said with an emotional voice, "will be born free. Free of debts, free of fear, surrounded by love." And while the family embraced this new reality, none of them could imagine that in Denver, Marcus Goldstein had discovered about the marriage and was planning a revenge that would test not only their love, but their determination to protect the new life that was coming. But for now, in the warmth of that morning embrace in the mountain cabin, the future seemed full of only golden possibilities, like the sunlight streaming through the windows and illuminating the beginning of a new generation of the Wheeler family. 1885, 4 years later. The cabin had transformed far beyond what Josiah could have imagined on that stormy night when the Thornton family knocked on his door. What had begun as a simple refuge for a lonely man was now the center of a small, prosperous community. Clara was in the kitchen, preparing dinner while watching through the window as her 2 children played in the yard. Mary Elizabeth, 3 years old, was a vivacious girl who had inherited her mother's brown hair and her father's quiet determination. Thomas Samuel, 2 years old, was a miniature force of nature, always exploring, always asking why, with the insatiable curiosity of a child raised in freedom. Josiah had expanded the mining operation, not with the ambition of getting rich, but with the wisdom of a man who had learned that real security comes from diversification and honest work. Samuel, now completely recovered, had become his official partner, bringing his blacksmith skills to improve both the mining efficiency and the quality of the tools they produced. Martha had transformed her sewing hobby into a prosperous business that served women for miles around. Her clothes were known for quality and beauty, and she had trained 2 young women from the neighboring town, creating jobs and opportunities where before there had been only limitations. But the most significant transformation on the Wheeler property was something that had begun almost by accident and become a cherished tradition throughout the region, the Wheeler table. It all started when an itinerant merchant appeared on a cold autumn night, asking for shelter. Clara, without hesitation, set an extra plate at the table. When the man tried to pay for the meal and lodging, she refused, saying simply, "A table always has room for one more." The news spread. Soon travelers were detouring from their routes to pass by the Wheeler cabin, knowing they would find not only food and shelter, but a table where they would be treated like family. Some were merchants, others miners looking for work, families moving to new lands, even men fleeing troubles they had left behind. Clara established only one rule. At the Wheeler table, no questions were asked about anyone's past. What mattered was the present, courtesy, mutual respect. "It's like Elizabeth always said," Josiah commented one night, watching Clara serve soup to a family of German immigrants who had lost everything in a fire. "A house built with love protects better than any fortress." "And now our house protects many more people than just us," Clara replied, smiling as she watched Mary Elizabeth try to teach basic German to the visiting children. Samuel had begun another project that had become equally important to the community. Working with Pastor Williams, he was documenting Civil War stories for the local Bear Creek newspaper. Every Sunday after worship, veterans gathered at the Wheeler cabin to share their memories, ensuring that future generations would know the sacrifices made by ordinary men in extraordinary times. "Stories," Samuel said, carefully writing each account in clear, legible handwriting, "are the only way to make the past immortal." Martha agreed, adding her own stories of Irish immigration, of the hardships and triumphs of families who came to America with nothing but courage and determination. "This cabin," she said one evening while teaching Mary Elizabeth to embroider, "is becoming a living book of stories. Every person who passes through here leaves a bit of their story, takes a bit of ours." The Wheeler family's prosperity didn't go unnoticed. Marcus Goldstein, who had silently observed and waited for 4 years, finally decided to act. Not with direct threats this time. He had learned that Josiah Wheeler wasn't easily intimidated. Instead, he used his influence to try to question the legality of the mining operation, claiming that the mineral rights on the Wheeler property weren't clear. It was Samuel who discovered the maneuver first, through contacts he maintained with other veterans in Denver. "Goldstein is trying to use bureaucracy as a weapon," he explained to the family gathered around the dinner table. "If he can get the state to question our mining rights, he can force a legal re-evaluation of the entire property." Clara, now a 30-year-old woman with the confidence that comes from building something lasting, didn't show the fear she would have felt years before. "Then we need to ensure our documentation is impeccable," she said simply, "and we need to prepare to fight in the courts if necessary." "It could cost a lot of money," Josiah warned. "We have money," Clara replied. "We have prosperous businesses, valuable properties, and friends throughout the region. We're no longer desperate people fleeing in the snow." She was right. The Wheeler family had become a pillar of the community. When news of Goldstein's attempts spread, offers of help came from all directions. Lawyers willing to work for reduced fees, merchants offering financial support, neighbors ready to testify about the family's character and contribution to the region. "Look at this," Martha said one afternoon while counting the support letters that arrived daily. "Goldstein thought he was attacking an isolated family. He's actually attacking an entire community." Goldstein's revenge proved to be his own defeat. The legal attention he brought to the region only served to highlight how the Wheeler family's activities benefited everyone around. The judge who reviewed the case not only confirmed all of Josiah's property rights, but publicly praised the family's contribution to the area's economic and social development. That night, after receiving news of the legal victory, the Wheeler family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset over the mountains that had truly become their home. "Do you know what this means?" Clara said, rocking Thomas Samuel while Mary Elizabeth nestled against Josiah. "What? It means our children will grow up truly free, without fear, without debts from the past, without shadows over their future." Samuel and Martha, now proud grandparents and respected community members, smiled as they watched the next generation playing in the yard of a house that had become a symbol of hope for the entire region. "Elizabeth would be proud," Martha said quietly to Josiah, "of the man you've become, of the family you've built, of the home this has become." Josiah nodded, looking at the portrait of his first wife, which still occupied the place of honor above the fireplace. "I think she would know she was right about houses built with love. They really do protect better than fortresses." As night descended over the Wheeler cabin, the sounds that echoed were different from those heavy silences Josiah had known for so many years alone. Now there were children's laughter, quiet conversations between adults planning the future, Martha's whisper singing an Irish lullaby, the sound of Samuel organizing his papers for another session of historical writing. And throughout the Rocky Mountain region, travelers looked at the lights of the Wheeler cabin shining like a beacon in the dark mountains, knowing they would find there not only shelter, but a living example of how mercy, honest work, and true love can build something beautiful and lasting even in the wildest places in the world. 1889, 8 years after the storm. The Wheeler property had become a small village. What had begun as a lonely cabin on a mountain ridge now included 3 additional houses, a large barn, a complete blacksmith workshop, and even a small school where Clara taught not only her own children, but the children of families who had settled in the area, attracted by the Wheeler family's reputation for hospitality and opportunity. Mary Elizabeth, now 7 years old, revealed herself as a natural little leader, organizing the games of younger children and showing social intuition that reminded everyone of her mother. Thomas Samuel, at 6 years old, had inherited both his grandfather's intellectual curiosity and his father's practical ability, spending hours in the workshop learning both Samuel's blacksmithing techniques and Josiah's carpentry secrets. But the newest addition to the Wheeler family was little Sarah Martha, 2 years old, a girl with golden hair and bright blue eyes who had brought a new dimension of joy to the house. She was a child who knew no fear, growing up surrounded by unconditional love and absolute security. Clara, now 33 years old, had become a respected matriarch, not only in her own family but throughout the region. Her informal school attracted children from miles away, and she had established a small library in the main cabin, with books donated by travelers from across the country. "Education," she always said, "is the only inheritance that can never be stolen." Samuel, at 75 years old, had become the unofficial historian of the Rocky Mountains. His project of documenting Civil War stories had expanded to include miners' accounts, immigrant stories, indigenous legends, and pioneer memoirs. He worked meticulously, knowing that each preserved story was a life that wouldn't be forgotten. Martha, at 72 years old, had trained a network of seamstresses that now operated in 5 different towns. More than a business, it had become a way to empower women, giving them economic independence and valuable skills. Josiah, at 53 years old, had found a perfect balance between work and family. The mining operation provided financial stability, but he never allowed the search for gold to overshadow the true riches he had found: a loving family, a prosperous community, a home that radiated peace. It was on a rainy Sunday in September that the family received an unexpected visit that would test everything they had built. Marcus Goldstein had died 2 years earlier, victim of a heart attack, but his son Heinrich had inherited both the business and his father's resentments. Heinrich was different from Marcus, younger, more educated, but also more ruthless. Where the father used brute intimidation, the son used sophisticated legal manipulation. "Mr. Wheeler," Heinrich said when Josiah opened the door, "I'm Heinrich Goldstein. I believe you knew my late father." Heinrich was a well-dressed man in his 40s, accompanied by a lawyer and 2 assistants. He carried an expensive leather briefcase and the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wants through legal means. "I remember your father," Josiah replied carefully. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. I'm here because while reviewing my father's business, I discovered some irregularities related to the agreement he made with Mrs. Wheeler some years ago." Clara appeared beside Josiah, now carrying little Sarah. "What kind of irregularities?" "Well, it seems the original contract specified delivery of $50 worth of clothes within 2 months. Our records show only $42 worth of merchandise was received. It was an obvious lie, but technically plausible. Heinrich had clearly studied the situation carefully. Samuel emerged from behind the children, walking with the help of a cane but still imposing. "Young man," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his years of military service, Our family honored every penny of that agreement. Your allegation is false. Naturally, you would believe that, Heinrich replied politely. But contracts are legal matters, not family matters. And the law is clear about what happens when contracts aren't honored. The lawyer stepped forward. The original debt with accumulated interest now amounts to $1,200. Mr. Goldstein is prepared to accept the property as full payment. It was a clever and cruel move. Heinrich had waited until the property became valuable enough to be worth stealing. This property is not for sale, Josiah said firmly. It may not be for sale, Heinrich replied, but it may be subject to legal confiscation if the debt isn't paid within 30 days. Clara looked at her children, who watched the conversation with wide, worried eyes. Mary Elizabeth, even at 7 years old, understood that something was threatening her family. Mr. Goldstein, Clara said with a controlled voice, this conversation is over. If you have legal matters to discuss, you can speak with our lawyer. Naturally, Mr. Jenkins here is prepared to serve the appropriate papers. The lawyer extended an official envelope. You have 30 days to respond. After the visitors left, the family gathered in the main room to discuss the situation. The children were sent to play outside, but Clara knew Mary Elizabeth was listening behind the door. She was too smart a girl to be completely fooled. Can he do this? Martha asked. Can he really question an agreement made 8 years ago? Samuel studied the papers carefully. Technically, yes, if he can prove there was breach of the original contract. The problem is, we don't have detailed records of the deliveries made at that time. But we fulfilled the agreement, Clara protested. We know that, Josiah said, but proving it in court might be difficult after so much time. It was then that Mary Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, carrying something in her small hands. Mamma, she said hesitantly, could this help? It was a small account book Clara had started keeping years before, meticulously documenting every piece of clothing made, every delivery completed. She had completely forgotten about the book, which Mary Elizabeth had found in a box of old papers. Clara opened the book with trembling hands. There they were, in her own careful handwriting, detailed records of every dress, every shirt, every piece delivered to Marcus Goldstein between May and July 1881. The total value, exactly $50.25. My smart daughter, Clara whispered, embracing Mary Elizabeth. You may have saved our house. Samuel smiled with pride. This girl has historian's instincts. She knew old documents could be precious. But even with proof of contract fulfillment, Heinrich Goldstein wouldn't give up easily. The legal battle that followed lasted 6 months and cost almost all of the family's savings. Heinrich had resources and influence, but the Wheeler family had something more powerful, an entire community willing to testify about their character, their contribution to the region, and the injustice of the allegations against them. The trial was held in Denver, in a courtroom packed with Wheeler family supporters. When the judge finally decided in favor of the Wheelers, the room erupted in applause. This family, the judge said in his final decision, represents the best of the American pioneer spirit. They transformed a wild place into a prosperous community, contributing not only to their own fortune, but to the good of everyone around them. The attempt to confiscate their property based on fabricated allegations is not only legally unfounded, but morally repugnant. Heinrich Goldstein was forced not only to withdraw his allegations, but to pay the Wheeler family's legal costs. That night, back at the cabin, the family gathered around the table that had so many times received needy strangers. Now they were celebrating victory over those who tried to take what they had built with love and honest work. Do you know what this means? Clara said, looking around the table at the faces she loved. What? Thomas Samuel asked. It means our house, our family, our future are secure, forever. Mary Elizabeth raised her small cup of milk. A toast, she said, with the solemnity of a child imitating adults, to our family, to our house, and to never giving up. To the Wheeler family, everyone echoed, raising their cups. And as their voices blended in the cabin lit by fireplace flames, echoing over the silent mountains, it was impossible not to feel that this wasn't just a legal victory, but confirmation that love, honest work, and the determination to help others can create something more powerful than any force that tries to destroy it. 1895, 14 years after the storm. Autumn was painting the mountains with its golden colors when Josiah Wheeler, now 59 years old, sat on the porch of the cabin where it all began, watching his youngest granddaughter, Catherine Elizabeth, play in the yard. The 3-year-old girl had been born to Mary Elizabeth, who had married the previous year to David Morrison, son of a prosperous Bear Creek merchant. The irony hadn't been lost on anyone. Jake Morrison had been Josiah's partner in the original property, and now his grandson had married Josiah's eldest daughter, as if the mountain had its own plans to ensure certain families remained connected across generations. Samuel had died peacefully 3 years earlier, at 80 years old, leaving behind a complete library of documented stories that was now consulted by historians throughout Colorado. His last words had been about how grateful he was to have lived long enough to see the family prosper and find true peace. Martha, now 78 years old, still supervised her network of seamstresses, though she spent more time teaching her techniques to a new generation of artisans than actually sewing. Her eyes weren't what they used to be, but her hands still moved with the precision of decades of practice. Thomas Samuel, now 12 years old, had revealed himself as a brilliant student who devoured all the books in Clara's small library. He spoke of someday going to university, studying engineering or perhaps law. Clara encouraged him, knowing the world was changing and that the mountains, much as she loved them, didn't need to be the limits of her children's dreams. Sarah Martha, at 8 years old, showed signs of having inherited both Martha's artistic abilities and Clara's practical determination. She spent hours drawing and sewing, but also insisted on learning carpentry with Josiah and blacksmithing with the men who now worked in the expanded operation. The Wheeler property had become more than a simple family operation. It was now a small commercial center that employed 15 people and served as a mandatory stopping point for travelers between Denver and the smaller mountain towns. The Wheeler table had become legendary. They said no one had ever been refused. No needy traveler had left the property without help. Clara, at 40 years old, had found the perfect balance between being mother, wife, businesswoman, and educator. Her unofficial school now had 23 regular students, and she was in correspondence with educators across the country about innovative teaching methods. There were even rumors that the state of Colorado was considering offering her an official position as educational supervisor for the mountain region. It was on a golden October afternoon that they received a visit that brought the past back unexpectedly. An elegant woman in her 40s arrived in a well-equipped carriage, accompanied by a driver and an assistant. When Josiah opened the door, she smiled nervously. "Mr. Wheeler, I'm Margaret Thornton Mackenzie. I'm Clara's cousin, daughter of her father's brother." Clara appeared quickly, drawn by the unfamiliar female voice. When she saw Margaret, her expression went through surprise, recognition, and finally, caution. "Maggie," she said carefully, "I wasn't expecting. How did you find us?" "It wasn't difficult. The Wheeler family is quite well known in Denver now." Margaret looked around the prosperous property with eyes that were clearly evaluating value. "I came because there are family matters that need to be discussed." Clara invited Margaret in, but there was a tension in the air that the children felt immediately. Thomas Samuel and Sarah Martha retreated to their room, but stayed nearby, curious about the visitor who was clearly making their mother uncomfortable. "Family matters?" Clara asked when they sat in the main room. "Well, when Papa died last year, we discovered some documents. It seems our grandfather left a small property in Jefferson County, a property that technically should have been divided among all the descendants of our generation." Margaret withdrew papers from her elegant purse. "You, as Samuel's daughter, have a right to a portion of that inheritance, but there are complications." Josiah, who had remained quiet until then, finally spoke. "What kind of complications?" "The property is being contested. Apparently our grandfather had made informal agreements with some people, agreements that are now being questioned in the courts." Margaret hesitated. "The legal costs are substantial, more than any of us can afford individually." Clara understood immediately. "You want us to contribute financially to a legal battle over a property that may not even exist." "It's not quite like that." "It's exactly like that," Clara said firmly. "Maggie, we haven't spoken for 15 years. You didn't come to Papa's wedding to Mama. You didn't come when he died. You never answered the letters I sent when the children were born. And now you show up wanting money to fight for a dubious inheritance." Margaret straightened, her friendly pose disappearing. "Clara, you were always very direct, but you can't simply ignore family responsibilities." "Family responsibilities," Clara repeated slowly. "Like the responsibility to visit sick relatives, to attend funerals, to answer letters, those family responsibilities." Martha, who had been listening from the kitchen, appeared in the doorway. "Margaret Mackenzie," she said with a cold voice. "I remember you. I remember how you treated Samuel when he lost the smithy, how you turned your back on this family when we needed help. Circumstances were different then." "They were," Martha agreed. "We were poor then. Now we're prosperous." "Interesting how that changes the definition of family responsibility." Margaret looked around the cabin, at the quality furniture, at the obvious signs of prosperity, at the evidence of a family that had built something substantial. "Very well," she said, her mask of familiarity finally falling completely. "I see money has changed you. You've become selfish." Josiah stood up. "I think it's time for you to leave." "Clara," Margaret said, making one last attempt, "if you don't help us, you might lose any right to grandfather's inheritance." Clara also stood. "Maggie, let me explain something about inheritance. Inheritance isn't just money or property. It's values, it's love, it's the knowledge of who you are and where you come from." She gestured around the cabin. "This house, this family, this life we've built, this is my real inheritance. This is the inheritance I'm going to leave for my children. I don't need anything else." After Margaret left, visibly irritated, the family gathered in the kitchen to process the visit. "Did I do the right thing?" Clara asked. "Maybe I should have at least considered—" "Daughter," Martha said, placing a calloused hand on Clara's shoulder, "you did exactly what your father would have done. You protected our family from people who only seek us out when they want something." Thomas Samuel, who had heard everything, asked a question that surprised everyone. "Mama, if someone came here asking for real help, not money but real help, would you give it?" "Of course I would," Clara replied immediately. "Then what's the difference?" Clara considered the question. "The difference, my dear, is between people who need help and people who want to take advantage. The difference is between extending a hand and having a hand bitten." That night, after the children went to sleep and Martha retired to her room, Clara and Josiah sat on the porch, watching the stars over the mountains that had become their world. "Sometimes I wonder," Clara said, "if we made the right decisions, if we closed our hearts when we should have kept them open." "Clara," Josiah said, taking her hand, "look around. Look at what we built. Look at our family, our community, all the people we helped over the years. Do you think a woman with a closed heart could have created all this?" Clara smiled, squeezing his hand. "I don't think so." "Then stop doubting yourself. You learned the difference between true charity and exploitation, between real family and opportunistic relatives. That's not hardness, it's wisdom." And as they sat together under the starry mountain sky, Clara finally understood that the true measure of a life isn't how many people you help, but how many you help genuinely, and how many times you're wise enough to recognize the difference. December 1895, the winter of truth. The season's first heavy snowfall came earlier than normal, covering the Wheeler property with a white blanket that reminded Josiah of that transformative winter of 1881. But this time, instead of lonely silence, the snow brought the sound of children's laughter playing in the yard and the aroma of fresh bread Clara was baking for the travelers who would arrive seeking shelter. It was during this snowfall that an unexpected discovery would forever change the family's understanding of their own history. Thomas Samuel, now 13 years old and possessing the insatiable curiosity of an intelligent teenager, had begun exploring the oldest corners of the property. In particular, he was fascinated by the shed where Josiah kept his oldest tools, the same place where years before Clara had discovered his first wood carvings. It was while helping to reorganize this shed that Thomas found something everyone had lost over the years, a small wooden box buried under decades of accumulated tools and materials. "Papa!" he shouted, running to the house with the box in his hands. "I found something, a box with Jake Morrison's name carved on the lid." Josiah stopped repairing a window and looked at the box with surprise. Jake Morrison had been his partner in the original mining, the man who had left him the property when he died. But Josiah thought he had found all of Jake's important belongings years ago. The family gathered in the main room while Josiah carefully opened the box. Inside, they found documents yellowed by time, some faded photographs, and letters tied with red ribbon. "They're letters from a woman named Rose," Clara said, examining the delicate handwriting on the fragile paper. "Love letters." Josiah opened one of the oldest letters and began reading silently, his expression gradually changing from curiosity to total amazement. "Josiah," Clara asked, "what is it?" "This letter. It's from 1878. Rose was writing to Jake about a child, a son she was raising alone after Jake left for Colorado." The silence in the room was absolute. Martha stopped knitting. Thomas Samuel and Sarah Martha looked at the adults, sensing something important was happening. Clara took another letter and opened it carefully. This one is from 1880. Rose says the child, a boy named David, is asking about his father. She begs Jake to return, or at least send money to help raise the son. Josiah continued reading, piecing together a tragic story. Jake Morrison had left a pregnant woman in Kansas when he departed to try his luck in the Colorado gold rush. For years, Rose had written letters pleading for recognition, support, any sign that Jake remembered her existence and the existence of their son. "Look at the last letter," Martha said, her voice laden with emotion. "It's from January 1881. Josiah opened the final letter, dated just weeks before Jake's death. His voice trembled as he read aloud, "Jake, our son David is now 10 years old. He's a good, hard-working boy who deserves to know his father. If you can't come home, at least write to him. At least acknowledge he exists. I can't keep pretending you died. He's too smart and asks too many questions. Please, Jake, please do the right thing before it's too late." "Jake died without ever responding," Clara murmured, "without ever acknowledging this son." Josiah looked at the photographs in the box. One showed a pretty young woman holding a baby. Another showed a boy of about 5 years with serious eyes and a hesitant smile. "David Morrison," he said slowly. "The father of the David who married our Mary Elizabeth is Jake's son." The revelation hit everyone simultaneously. David Morrison, who had married Mary Elizabeth the previous year, was technically heir to the Wheeler property. He was the son of the man who had originally owned the land Josiah had inherited. "What does this mean?" Thomas Samuel asked, ever practical. "Legally, I mean." Martha, who had developed a deep understanding of legal matters through the years of battles with the Goldsteins, slowly shook her head. "It could mean David has a legal right to the property Jake left to Josiah, especially if he can prove Jake never formally recognized him, never made provisions for him." Clara looked at Josiah with concern. "Do you think David knows? That he married Mary Elizabeth knowing this?" "No," Josiah said immediately. "I've known that boy since he was a child. He's honest, straightforward. If he knew of any connection to this property, he would have mentioned it." "But now we know," Martha said, "and he has the right to know too." The family spent the rest of the afternoon discussing the situation. The implications were complex, not just legal but emotional. David Morrison was now part of their family through marriage to Mary Elizabeth, but he was also, technically, the son of the man whose property rights Josiah had inherited. "He needs to know," Clara said finally. "We can't keep this secret. It wouldn't be right." "What if he decides to challenge our ownership of the land?" Thomas Samuel asked. "Then we'll face that," Josiah replied. "But we'll face it as a family. David is our son-in-law now. Mary Elizabeth is our daughter. Whatever happens, we'll resolve it together." That night, Josiah rode through the snow to David and Mary Elizabeth's house, carrying the box of documents and the weight of a revelation that would change everything. David Morrison was a 25-year-old young man, tall and thin, with the serious eyes Josiah recognized from the old photographs. When Josiah explained what they had discovered, David remained silent for a long time, studying the letters and photographs. "My mother died when I was 16, he said finally. "Before she died, she told me my father had left for Colorado, but she never mentioned the name Jake Morrison. I always thought he had simply disappeared." Mary Elizabeth, pregnant with her first child, held her husband's hand. "David, does this change anything for you? About us? About our family?" David looked around the small house they had built together, then looked at Josiah. "Mr. Wheeler, Josiah, you created a life on this land. You, Clara, Samuel, Martha, you transformed a wild place into a home, into a community. I may be Jake Morrison's blood son, but you are my true family." He returned the letters and photographs to Josiah. "These belong to you. They're part of this property's history, this family's history. I don't want anything more than what I already have. A place in this family, a wife I love, a future for our children." Josiah felt his eyes fill with tears. "David, are you sure? Legally, you would have rights." "Josiah," David interrupted gently, "legal rights and true family are two very different things. You taught me that just by the way you live." When Josiah returned home that night, he found Clara waiting at the door. "So?" she asked. "David renounced any legal rights. He said we're his true family." Clara smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. "Of course he said that. He's exactly the kind of man our Mary Elizabeth would choose." "Clara," Josiah said, embracing her, "I think I finally understand something." "What?" "This land, This family, it's not about blood or legal rights or inheritance. It's about choices. It's about choosing to stay, choosing to love, choosing to build something together. Clara nestled against him. Jake Morrison may have given you this property, but you gave it life. You gave it love. You gave it family. And as the snow continued falling over the Wheeler cabin, covering both present and past with its white blanket, they knew they had finally come full circle, that all the lost stories had been found, all secrets revealed, and that the future could be built on the solid foundation of truth and chosen love, not merely inherited. Spring 1896, 15 years after the storm. The final chapter of the Wheeler family story began on a radiant May morning when Clara awakened with the first contractions of labor for her fourth child. At 41 years old, she had insisted this would be her last pregnancy, but Josiah knew she was secretly excited about the idea of having another baby to love. Martha, now 79, but still agile when necessary, took command of the situation with the efficiency of an experienced general. She sent Thomas Samuel to fetch the midwife from Bear Creek, instructed Sarah Martha to handle household chores, and established a central command in the kitchen from where she would coordinate all activities. The baby, a healthy boy they named Samuel David Wheeler, honoring both grandfather and son-in-law, was born at noon when the sun was highest over the mountains. His first cry echoed through the cabin like a declaration that the Wheeler family would continue to grow and prosper. Josiah held his newborn son with trembling hands, remembering when he had held Mary Elizabeth for the first time 15 years before. But now there was a fundamental difference. This time he held the baby not only with love, but with absolute certainty that this child would grow up safely, surrounded by a family that had learned to face any challenge together. "Look at him," Clara whispered, exhausted but radiant. "Look how perfect he is." Mary Elizabeth, who had come running from her own house when she learned labor had begun, held her newborn half-brother with tears in her eyes. "He has Papa's eyes," she said, "but Mama's nose." "He has the calm Wheeler temperament," Martha observed, smiling. "This one's going to be a quiet boy." As if to contradict her, little Samuel David began crying with enough force to be heard in the barn. The celebration party took place 3 days later, when Clara was strong enough to receive visitors. The property filled with friends and neighbors who had become chosen family over the years. Pastor Williams, who had married Josiah and Clara, David Morrison and his wife Mary Elizabeth, now also pregnant, the families of miners and merchants who had settled in the area, attracted by the Wheeler family's reputation for hospitality. But it was during this celebration that Martha made an announcement that changed the atmosphere from festive to one of respectful reverence. "There's something I need to say," she said, slowly rising with the help of her cane. "Something about this family, about this house, about what all of us have built here." Conversation diminished when everyone realized Martha wanted to speak. "When we arrived here 15 years ago," she continued, "we were refugees. Desperate people fleeing problems that seemed bigger than our ability to solve them. Josiah Wheeler gave us shelter, when any sensible man would have sent us away." Josiah began to protest, but Martha raised a hand. "Let me finish. This man saved us, not just from cold and hunger, but from despair. He gave us not just a house, but a home, not just safety, but dignity." She looked around the room full of people who had been touched by the Wheeler family's generosity over the years. But what Josiah didn't realize, what none of us realized at the time, is that by saving us, he saved himself too. This house was dead before we arrived. It was just wood and stone where a lonely man waited to die. Clara took Josiah's hand, squeezing it gently. "Now look around," Martha said, gesturing to the smiling faces, to the children playing, to the evidence of abundant life. "This is no longer a lonely man's house. This is a house where love multiplied through the years, where generosity created more generosity, where a small family became an entire community." Pastor Williams stood up. "Martha is right. The Wheeler family didn't just build a house on this mountain. They built an example of how ordinary people can create extraordinary things when they choose love instead of fear." Thomas Samuel, now 14 and on the threshold of adulthood, surprised everyone by standing up as well. "I want to say something," he said, his voice cracking slightly with adolescent change. "I grew up hearing stories about how this family began, about the storm that brought my grandparents here, about how my parents met." He looked at Josiah and Clara. "But I think the most important part of the story isn't how you met. It's how you chose to keep choosing each other, every day, For all these years, the silence that followed was filled only by the soft sounds of the baby sleeping in Clara's lap. "When I'm an adult," Thomas Samuel continued, "I want to build something like this. Not necessarily a house on a mountain, but a life that matters, a life that makes a difference for other people." Sarah Martha stood beside her brother. "Me too. I want to be like Mama and Grandma Martha, strong enough to help other people, wise enough to know when someone really needs help." Josiah looked around the room, at the faces he had learned to love, at the family that had grown far beyond anything he could have imagined 15 years before. "When Elizabeth died," he said finally, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room, "I thought my life was over. I thought all I could do was survive until I died." He looked at Clara, who held their son in her lap. "I didn't know life could begin again. I didn't know love could be multiplied instead of divided. I didn't know a winter storm could bring not just refugees but angels." Clara smiled through tears. "We all saved each other. That's what families do." The party continued late into the night, but eventually the visitors departed, leaving only the nuclear family gathered around the table that had become the heart of the Wheeler house. Little Samuel David slept in the cradle Thomas Samuel had built as a carpentry project, watched by older siblings who already showed the protective instinct that characterized the Wheeler family. "Do you know what I want this boy to know when he grows up?" Clara asked, pointing to the baby. "What?" Josiah asked. "I want him to know he was loved before he was born, that he grew up in a house where refugees became family, where strangers became brothers, where love was always stronger than fear." Martha, tired but happy, nodded from her chair by the fire. "And I want him to know," she added, "that true inheritance isn't what you receive, but what you build. It's not what your parents leave you, but what you leave for your children." Thomas Samuel looked out the window at the mountains that rose like silent guardians around their house. "And I want him to know," the teenager said with wisdom beyond his years, "that home isn't a place. Home is where your family is. Home is where you choose to love and be loved." Josiah stood and walked to the fireplace, where Elizabeth's portrait still occupied its place of honor. But now it was accompanied by other photographs of the family gathered, of special moments, of celebrations and achievements that had marked the 15 years of growth and love. "Elizabeth," he murmured to the portrait, "I hope you can see this. I hope you can see how the love you taught me multiplied, how it became something greater than any of us could have imagined." And as the Wheeler family prepared for sleep on that spring night, with the newest baby sleeping safely in his cradle and the older children whispering plans for the future, there was a sense of completeness that transcended any individual happiness. They had learned the most important truth of all, that life isn't about surviving storms, but about learning to dance in the rain. That family isn't just about blood, but about choice. That home isn't where you were born, but where you choose to stay and grow and love. Outside, the wind whispered through the mountain pines, carrying echoes of a storm that had happened 15 years before, the storm that had brought 3 desperate refugees to a lonely man's door, and in a single night had changed all their lives forever.